This last session will be moderated by Dr. Juwita Mohammed, Acting Research Director and Director of Economics and Business Unit at IDEAS, together with Mr. Loh Zenting, Research Executive at IDEAS, our co-moderator for the session. For your information, our last session today will be fully virtual. Now, without further ado, I would like to invite our moderators together with our esteemed speakers for the final topic, Mr. Nurhisyam Hussein, Chief Strategy Officer at Employee Provident Fund, EPF Malaysia, and Ms. Sharifuddin, Senior Country Economist, the World Bank. Please welcome. With that, I would like to pass the session to our moderator, Dr. Juwita.
Thank you so much, Sally. Your Excellencies, honored guests, honored speakers, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our session on economic recovery and resilience in Malaysia. I am Juwita and I will be your moderator this afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, let me set the stage a bit for our discussion. If we look at the past 2 years, it hasn't been easy for the economy and the Malaysian society as a whole. After a long combat against the spread of the pandemic, the Malaysian economy is finally recovering along with the rest of the world. We can see that in trade surplus numbers of about 18% by October 2021. And this is again accompanied by strong growth in the digital economy and digital trade activities. In the ICT industry, we saw that the sector contributed to about 23% to Malaysia's 2020 GDP. And we can also see e-commerce income for 2021, most of 2021 came up to a total of 801 billion ringgit, which is again a 23% jump from the previous year. When we look at ASEAN, the Asian Development Bank estimated that we will achieve a growth rate of about 4.7% this year, again, in light of the expected ease of restrictions and also revival of economic activities. So it seems like both the regional and domestic economies will or are picking up. And again, these are positive notes to feed upon. But again, on the road to recovery, we see that there's several incidences of floods, in addition to price hikes and also food shortages. And again, we're in the midst of another wave of the Omicron variant, all within the last few months. So again, the journey to full recovery will be a bumpy one in 2022. So we'll be talking about what kind of domestic and also global economic challenges are ahead in front of us. When we look at Malaysia as a small open economy, how should Malaysia as a small open economy respond to these challenges, taking into account stronger global demand and also stronger international trade on top of the COVID-19 digital transformation wave. So again, we are here joined by two well-known speakers, Puan Sharifuddin from the World Bank and Mr. Nurhisyam Hussein from EPF. Unfortunately, Associate Professor Dr. Yusof is unwell and couldn't join us today. We hope for his speedy recovery. So as an introduction to our first speaker, Puan Sharifuddin is a senior economist with the macroeconomics trade and investment global practice at the World Bank Inclusive Growth and Sustainable Finance Hub in KL. One of her main responsibilities is leading the publication for one of the bank's flagship reports, the biannual Malaysian Economic Monitor, and participating in the dialogue on various advisory and also analytical engagements with the government. So she also provides cross-country support to other World Bank's country offices, such as Myanmar and also the Philippines. Before joining the World Bank, Puan Shakira worked as an economist at the BNM in the Monetary Policy Department. Puan Shakira obtained her master's degree in public administration from Columbia University, New York, and is now a PhD student at the Institute of Education at the University College London. So I would like to invite Puan Shakira to share her views on both macro and microeconomic challenges that she thinks Malaysia is facing in the year to come, and how this would impact growth in the short to medium term. Puan Shakira, you have the floor.
Thanks, Dr. Juwita, and thank you, colleagues at IDEAS, for having me this afternoon. This is definitely a great opportunity and great honor to be with all of you today. Prior to this session, we had a quick chat with Dr. Juwita in terms of how we would structure today's session. So I thought maybe as an introduction, I could give basically an overview. I think Dr. Juwita already alluded to that in her introductory remarks as to what we can expect within the short term. And maybe I can stop there, and then we can have a longer follow-up on what are some of the medium-term to longer-term challenges. So I think let's start with a quick recap of what has transpired in 2021. And so we saw, at least in the last quarter of last year, the recovery process is sort of already started. And part of it was driven by the gradual reopening of the economy after we reached a certain target for the vaccination rate. So that contributed to the recovery, to the start of the recovery process. And we also saw improvements in the labor market, and this is very much reflected in the unemployment numbers that we saw. And then at the same time, there were some concerns about, or issues rising about, inflationary price pressures, which sort of translated into this debate over higher cost of living. Again, part of it is contributed by the adverse weather conditions. We saw some of the situation being affected by the floods last year, and that was also partly, while it didn't have a bigger impact on the GDP numbers itself, certainly the flood episode has some longer lasting impact for households, particularly more vulnerable households. So that was basically the ending for 2021. And so what can we expect in 2022? So obviously, I think you speak to any economist here in Malaysia from any banks, the narrative is, yes, this is the recovery year in 2022. And again, it's going to be very much driven by the opening up of the economy. We heard the announcements yesterday from Prime Minister where there would basically we are almost returning to pre-pandemic sort of operations, so to speak. So all this talk about transition to endemicity, as what some public health experts would call it. And that would definitely lead to a lot of a jump in domestic demand and consumption. Particularly, there's a lot of pent-up demand there, especially coming Hari Raya holidays and with the tourism opening up again. That would certainly give a big bump to private consumption, and also possibly some tailwind effects from what we could expect to be election spending, maybe this year, maybe next year, but that could play a role as well. External demand definitely will continue to provide some support, although there's a bigger question mark there, especially in light of recent developments. But overall, this is what we expect growth to be driven, at least for in the near term. But with that, of course, comes some of the risks, and obviously it continues to tilt towards the downside. So the military conflict in Ukraine definitely is becoming have been emerging as a key risk. At this point, in terms of our own internal assessment, it's still sort of a discussion within the bank. On a net basis, some countries may benefit in the short term, particularly commodity exporters. Possibly like Malaysia as well. But of course, there are certain exposures and contagion on financial side, on the trade side. So we're still sort of performing our own internal estimates, but that definitely is a key factor on growth in the near term. And that would definitely have an impact on how the advanced economies are going to perform this year as well. And that certainly would have some cascading impacts to the Malaysian economy, particularly on the external front. Other risks could also include, continuance or in the supply chain disruptions that we saw happening last year. And then finally, we are opening up the economy, but as what we have learned in the past 2 years, a new variant, a more serious, more severe could emerge. We hope not, given that most of us are already inoculated, but that could possibly be an outside risk. What sort of the policy priorities should be in the short term? So one is still to continue to protect the vulnerable groups. In terms of these include your low-income households, those without adequate social protection. So targeted support should continue by the government in the short term. And then we expect with the rise in oil prices, the jump in oil prices, that would provide some temporary boost for fiscal position in Malaysia. And so, the provision for continuous support for household, especially in the near term, certainly would be very much welcome. So I will stop there for now. I'm more than happy to take up follow-up questions, or we can continue with Hisham. Thanks.
Thank you, Puan Shakira. Yes, let's circle back to you after we have a listen to our next speaker, Mr. Nurhisyam Hussein, who is the Chief Strategy Officer for the EPF. His division oversees corporate strategy, communications, HR, economic research, and also enterprise project management. So before this position, he also headed the economic research team at the EPF. He joined EPF after a short stint at MARC, producing country reports, developing economic viewpoints, and also making quantitative forecasts. So Nurhisyam holds a bachelor's in monetary economics from the University of London School of Economics and Political Science, and a master's in economics from University Malaya. Thank you, Mr. Nurhisyam. So the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Juwita, and also thank you to IDEAS for inviting me again. Always a pleasure. I don't know how much I can add to what Shakira as well as Dr. Juwita said just now. I can add a little bit of color. I think if I can share some of the slides, if I may. I think all this stuff, of course, is when we were looking at the outlook for this year, it was all before February 24th, obviously. So a lot of things have changed over the last couple of weeks. Let me sort this out. So I have some numbers on the impact of all the EPF withdrawals last year, but let me just go over the outlook as far as we're concerned. I think one of the key things, just to underscore what Shakira said just now, the global stringency index has come down. I think this is on a global basis. This is actually an index looking at mobility restrictions. So globally, it's come off. I think if you look at Google mobility trends, I think people are coming back to work, and that includes Malaysia. The outlook is generally positive for the global economy. Of course, this is before Russia-Ukraine. And I think stock markets were starting to look up again. The big, I think, fly in the ointment was really inequality in terms of vaccine access. I think Africa is now at roughly about 10% double dose compared to, for example, just looking at Malaysia, we're at 98% of all adults. And we're close to about 50. I think we're a little over 50% on the booster shots already. We had fairly solid numbers in the fourth quarter last year. Unemployment rates have come down. The latest unemployment number was yesterday at 4.2%, covering for January. So unemployment has fallen below 700K for 2 months in a row. And also, I think far more interesting is something that DOSM actually started collecting when the first MCO hit. They started collating data on people who were employed but temporarily unable to work. And the numbers are quite amazing. I think during April 2020, very nearly 5 million people were not able to work. It's about 36% of the total labor force could not work, which is an amazing number. But right now we're looking at, if you combine the two numbers together, unemployed plus unable to work, The number is now about 4.7%. So massive improvement. I can actually show you what it looks like afterwards if I get the chance. But there has been a lot of assistance given by the government. I think EPF alone, we were looking at 110 billion ringgit, I think, in terms of both withdrawals as well as from the contribution cut. Looking ahead, I think credit growth is starting to pick up. NPLs have started to decline. All the leading indicators are pointing up. Commodity prices generally are positive for Malaysia, with one caveat. I think palm oil generally helps in terms of rural incomes, but if you look at oil and gas, which is where the action really is happening right now, the spillover effects are actually quite narrow because the oil and gas industry directly doesn't employ a whole lot of people. They're quite well paid, but there's just not many of them. So I think last year's story in terms of the beginning of the recovery, very similar. It was manufacturing, it was commodities, it was largely export oriented. So the domestic economy was relatively weak. And we're hoping, especially with opening of borders soon, we're going to start seeing improvement in that score as well. And just to underscore this, this is a look at EPF data across the last 3 years or so. In terms of active members, the red line on the right there, this is the number of people who contribute on a month, at least once a year. That number actually started rising quite dramatically, I think, towards the end of last year. And you can see the impact of that the MCOs generally had in terms of contributions, as well as on the labor force. But I think more positively, what we saw more recently is that when we look at those who are paying contributions on a monthly basis, we've now exceeded the pre-pandemic level. It was 5.6 million, I think, when we started in February 2020. It's now at 5.8 million. And we're seeing the same thing on the employer side, where new employer registration is actually quite bullish. It's actually well above the pre-pandemic levels. And we're also seeing, very similar to the banking industry, we're seeing defaulters actually continue to drop. Roughly last year, we saw almost a 40% drop. So I think the overall picture that we see is that the economy is on a much stronger footing. The recovery is spreading to a lot more domestic sectors as opposed to external facing sectors. And it should take a better hold this year. Having said that, I think if I could just, let me drop this first. Having said that, I mean, we started our risk assessment of Russia and Ukraine, I think about a month before the invasion actually happened, and trying to figure out the impact. Obviously, from a direct economic impact, it's actually quite minor. We don't have a lot of exposure to either Russia or Ukraine. There's not a whole lot of trade going on there. Even tourism is quite minimal. Having said that, we can't discount the indirect impact that Russia-Ukraine would have on the European, American, and other economies. The rise in commodity prices is quite worrying. We had a lot of dislocation in the markets, I think, over the last couple of days. Nickel prices actually spiked, I think, 5 times. It went up from, it went up 60% in one day, basically. And I think natural gas in Europe is now at $80 per MMBTU. This is 10 times higher than it was last year. So all these dislocations will have an impact, I think, in terms of growth. It will have an impact in terms of welfare. One of the biggest worries I have, there are a couple of things actually. One is, of course, you look at Russia and Ukraine, they're big exporters of minerals, not just oil and gas. And this will have a knock-on impact across the whole supply chain. You're talking about batteries, you're talking about cars, you're talking about semiconductors. All of those prices are likely to rise. Second, and much more of a concern, is that central banks can do a lot of things in terms of managing inflation, but they can't do anything on the supply side. And Russia-Ukraine supplies almost a quarter, or a little bit over a quarter of the global supply of wheat. And there's a very real risk of potential famine, especially across less developed economies. And that's obviously going to have, again, a knock-on impact on most economies around the world. So regardless of the domestic situation, which looks very positive, I think, we have a lot of risk factors. The situation is very fluid. I think yesterday also, the Russian government actually banned all exports of any kind of Russian goods up to the end of the year. That will have a massive knock-on effects across many types of industries. And obviously, there's going to be a problem in terms of sustaining growth in that environment. So generally, we've got a slightly mixed picture here. I think from the domestic situation, it's looking up. But there's a lot of things I think that are, we're still trying to make sense of, I think, in terms of the global situation. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out the geopolitical ramifications of this. I was born in the same year as the Prague Spring and the Tet Offensive. So this, to me, the first 20 years of my life, I lived under the threat of the bomb. And it's very disheartening to see it coming back again. This is I think this is a situation which you need to watch very carefully. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Nurhisyam. I think the overarching theme here is, again, the impact, how the war from the other side of the world will impact our small open economy. So just coming back to that and on inflation rates, I would like to pose this question just for us audiences to digest. So again, on inflation rates, as you mentioned, Mr. Nurhisyam, of course, the Bank Negara Malaysia does have like different tools under its belt to remedy the high increase of inflation rates. But how do you see BNM responding? Will it increase its OPR by how many basis points, and will it continue again to next year? That's what I heard. So I would just like to get the views of both of our speakers on this businesses preempting and also savers and investors preempting the rise of OPR, not just within this year, but also next year. So whoever wants to go first. For Shakira?
Well, I'm always conscious speaking on behalf of the central bank, and I was from that institution, so I sort of understand the parameters that we are operating here. But as Hisham said, in terms of the inflationary pressures that we are expected to see in the near term, it's definitely a supply driven, mostly coming, of course, from the commodity end. So on that note, I think if you look at historical data, historical precedents, the central bank sort of has rarely been sort of reactive to any movement in supply, any supply-driven inflation, because for that matter, it is supply-driven. I would sort of sway a bit from this topic, but I think while in terms of policy-wise, I think the central bank has already come up and say it's accommodative in the near term. But I guess the bigger issue that would be in discussion amongst, I guess, public policymakers is the rising cost of living for each and every individual, because that definitely would have an impact. I thought in this sense, it's more of a fiscal response that we are going to see, or we have seen, in terms of the price controls. And to some extent, again, like I mentioned earlier, there is sort of like a slight positive spillover from the jump in fuel prices, in the sense that there is buffer on the government to sort of provide any support on this front. And so in terms of, for example, fuel prices, it could be on a net basis, we are sort of toying on this, but we feel that it still benefits the government, and so it will see a continued, I guess, lid on fuel prices, for example. So that would definitely cushion the impact. But that definitely doesn't run from the issue of, higher prices from food prices, for example. So again, I would think that the policy response would come more from the government side, from the fiscal side, rather than from monetary policy, at least in the near term. So I'll stop there. Perhaps Hisham might come in and add.
Yeah, my favorite hobby horse. Okay, I think in terms of policy, I totally agree with Shakira. This is not something that monetary policy can handle. If you look at the elements of the increase in the cost of living, you're primarily looking at food and transport, right? On the one hand, if you're looking at the oil and gas situation, yes, prices were rising before Russia-Ukraine, largely due to an increase in demand, I think, but also partly due to a lack of investment in oil and gas production over the last couple of years. I think the speed of the recovery, especially in Western nations, has come as a surprise to everybody, I think businesses and the government alike. And that's largely due to the unique nature of the COVID crisis. It's not an economic crisis per se, it's a health crisis. And the restrictions put on mobility, I think the change in the work environment, working from home versus working from the office, all of those are easily reversible, so to speak, right? So the speed of recovery, I think, was much stronger than anybody really accounted for. So supply didn't really keep up at the time. We're likely going to have to handle a period of just higher prices for a while. The food situation is a lot more complicated. Even leaving aside Russia, Ukraine, food prices have been steadily rising at roughly twice the pace of overall inflation for the last decade and a half. It's been running at 4 or 5%, not at 2. So a lot of the pressures here are actually coming from there. And this is almost purely a supply side phenomenon. As a rule, the world as a whole does produce enough food to feed everybody, but it's very uneven in terms of its distribution. That's one. Second thing, I think looking at the specific markets that we need to deal with, if you're looking at grains, it's being threatened by climate change. Whether you're talking about wheat, whether you're talking about corn, whether you're talking about cereals. One absolutely fascinating fact I discovered a few weeks ago. The hectareage of that is used for soy planting in the United States increased 10% last year, but the yield dropped 10%. So you got a 20% difference in terms of the yield per hectareage actually coming out, and that's coming from climate change. Same thing has happened in Brazil. We had drought in Latin America. We had some drought in Central Asia as well, which affected yields in Ukraine and Russia. And this is even before we're talking about any shutoff of wheat supplies coming out of there. And we're seeing it across the board in a lot of different food categories. Fisheries is not so much climate change, but it's being impacted by overfishing. We went from roughly about 30% overfished areas in 1980 to 60 to 70% today. So supplies are being heavily impacted by that. We're going to continue to see food inflation regardless of what central banks do, right? And fundamentally, it's a question of really increasing supply or actually managing the supply that we already have, because with climate change, the areas that are under cultivation for specific agriculture products also is shifting. So we're entering a period where, especially over the next 20, 30 years or so, we really need to figure out what to do about food supply, because it's not something that is, it's not a financial problem, it's a real economy problem. And you can only do that with governments as well as industry being involved. Thank you.
On the note of food supply, I was just wondering if I could ask both of your views on the price control, and of course, to curb price hikes and also inflation. There are both fiscal and monetary policies that are available as tools. But again, the government in the past has put price control and has subsidized energy and also a few essential goods. And I was just wondering if this is the way to go. I'm sure this, as a short term, this is a very targeted way to curb the rise of price hikes and to curb negative impacts of inflation on vulnerable households. But looking at the near future, do you think that another way, a more sustainable way can be thought of?
Well, maybe I can come in first, and then, as usual, Hisham can come in later. Yes. Okay. Yes. On that note, I think, as you said, Dr. Juwita, in the short term, usually, yes, it does provide some relief, particularly for lower income household when it comes to price controls and subsidies. But I think the bigger question is when it comes to this sort of subsidies, particularly fuel subsidies. These are untargeted subsidies, and it takes up almost, a big chunk, almost 50% of the subsidy spending by the governments. And then I think there was a study done by Bank a few years ago that shows that the bulk of the recipients of fuel subsidies are those in high income households. So it's basically a simple way of describing it is really inefficiency in spending. And on top of that, we also see, and this sort of brings me to the more structural issues, which we can discuss later, is in terms of the Malaysia's social safety net in general. So there is definitely breadth in terms of coverage, but the issue has always been depth. And that has, issues like this, untargeted subsidies sort of exacerbates the situation already. I mean, and the crux of the problem is also you have to look from the income side as well, because I think we've talked a lot about expenditure and how sort of putting a lid on it, but and that is sort of being the quick panacea to, I guess, help the household's purchasing power. But I think that there should be a bigger conversation on the income side as well. But again, the short answer to this, it's yes, in the short term, it definitely provides relief, but it's basically inefficiency in social spending, which definitely has big room to improve, as the likes of EPF and if Dr. Yusof is here, that these guys can elaborate on that as well. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think when I think about price controls, I think you really need to go back to the root cause of why it might work or might not work. Price controls are useful when you have seasonal spikes in prices, when you have seasonal spikes or drops in supply. Basically, it works when you're looking at factors as being temporary. You cannot use price controls against a secular decline in production, for example, or a secular rise in prices. It's impossible. It's never ending. So in that sense, I think price controls for food are non-viable unless you're looking at it from, say, you put the price controls during Chinese New Year, right? That works. It's fine. It's not going to work when you're looking at basically structural changes in supply. So on that basis, I think you really need to be very careful about how it's implemented, when it's implemented, and really understand what's causing price increases rather than trying to, it's like the little boy trying to, plug the hole in the dike of his finger. You just plug that one, something else is going to come out, right? So there's a time and place for price controls. There's a time and place for not using price controls.
Yes, and it should be short term. That's a key word, short term. So meaning in a medium to long term, there needs to be another sustainable way, a more formalized social safety net. Coming back to that, I think the audience and myself, we're actually dying to find out why talking about social safety nets, why were the dividends for EPF recorded to be higher than the pre-pandemic levels? Why is this so? I mean, it's good news. Why is this so? Do you see such high rates to also be sustained in the next few years, given the post-pandemic growth? What is your take on that?
Well, the simple answer is the US and European stock markets did very well last year. And we took advantage of that. This year's a different story. I think, because by law, EPF is required to distribute all the income it makes. So, if markets are doing well, we do well. If markets are doing well, we don't do well. It's as simple as that. Last year, I think the domestic markets weren't that great. I think, if I remember correctly, domestic ROI was a little under 5%. whereas the foreign ROI that we got was almost touching 10%. So we made a mint on foreign markets, and that's the reason why the performance was so good as far as the dividend is concerned. But of course, if you look at where markets are today, foreign markets aren't doing so well. So if you ask me about sustainability, we do the best we can depending on how the markets are doing. We diversify as much as we can to ensure that we're not overly exposed to any particular single market. So that means we have a foot in both domestic and foreign markets as well. We also have broad exposure across a lot of different asset classes. So hopefully that evens things out. And that's how we've been able to keep the yield roughly stable around the 5%, 6% level. Fingers crossed we'll be able to do it again. But, in terms of what the outlook is for this year, I wouldn't see it repeated just yet.
Okay, thank you.
Managing expectations. Just managing expectations.
Okay, that's good for the investors to know. And for Shakira, coming back to what you mentioned about targeted support, and that was a very interesting finding, that the subsidies for oil consumption actually benefited a specific households more than the B40 households. Like how do you, like what steps can be taken to rectify these inconsistencies? Should there be a different mechanism for targeting vulnerable households, or should we slowly phase out, or should we slowly rationalize the subsidies for oil consumption?
Well, that's a lot to unpack, and actually it covers sort of some of the long-term issues that I outlined earlier. I think let's start in terms of the problem of the issue of targeting itself. I think that has been one of the key challenges for Malaysia's social safety net, in that it has breadth in the sense that those who actually need it get something. But the problem has always been the amount that they get is usually very small or insignificant to make any big changes in their lives, which is what the original intention of it is. So I think there are several things that one can think about in terms of policy implication. One is, of course, better targeting. It's easier said than done. I think one of the things that is what sort of a stumbling block in this regard is data and fragmentation within the system. And I think for any researcher in Malaysia, the challenges and sometimes frustration when it comes to data issues. So it's not just that, but the overall social system is also fragmented in that certain schemes or certain assistance are monitored or are managed by certain ministries, for example. Certain programs are administered by Jabatan Pusat Zakat and so on and so forth. So there is no, consolidated place or platform where information can be extracted, and then from there better targeting can be done. So that's possibly the first step that needs to be looked at. I guess the bigger issue here is, of course, in terms of fiscal policy itself. Now, where we look at Malaysia in general in terms of fiscal policy, it has not been playing a big redistributive role as compared to other advanced economies, if you will. And part of it is because in terms of the revenue collection itself, we see over the years, at least for the last 10 years or so, revenue has been declining. And at the same time, government expenditure has been locked in committed expenditures such as wages, pensions, and these sort of basically narrows down the scope for any possibility, any thinking on the government side to actually expand or improve social safety net, because you are basically working from a very small starting point. So that again is a big challenge in the near term. And for me personally, as somebody who looks at macro, this is definitely the biggest macroeconomic challenge for Malaysia going forward. I think there is also better need in terms of the overall spending efficiency itself. So we spend a lot on programs in terms of monitoring and evaluation. Malaysia doesn't do very well on that front. We plan a lot. We plan very good. We have blueprints here, documents there. We ourselves at the bank publishes year in, year out, a lot of reports. But I think one has to basically take stock of how all these programs are doing in the first place in order for us to improve targeting and going back to our initial point of discussion. So there's a lot to talk about, to discuss there. So maybe I'll stop there and then keep it open to everybody.
Thank you, Shakira. You mentioned on wages, right? So I want to pose the next question or something to digest on for Mr. Nurhisyam on wages. So from your presentation, it was found that registration of workers have increased. Do you think that this is because of the preempting of the rise of the minimum wage or the increase of the minimum wage, or is it just the economy expanding in a more positive sentiment for both businesses and consumers? What is your take on that?
I think it's the latter, because what we're seeing right now is that both the number of salary workers is increasing, but also the number of employer registrations is increasing. So I don't think it's got anything to do with people trying to get locked in before the minimum wage happens. In any case, minimum wage would require any contracts to be readjusted anyway. So there is quite a bit of strength there. I think as far as our numbers are indicating, we were looking at, especially during the fourth quarter last year, we're looking at 7% growth across most income categories. But it's even stronger at the bottom. I think the bottom was looking at between 15 to 20% increases over the fourth quarter of last year. So far this year, I think the salary growth has continued to hold up. I'm waiting on the latest data for February because it will be quite interesting to see whether people got bonuses this year. I suspect this is going to be the first year in 2 years where most people got bonuses. So that, again, that's fairly positive for, I think, the labor market. All indications are that the labor market is strengthening quite nicely.
And for Shakira, what is your take on the increase of the minimum wage? Do you think it's timely? I mean, I'm going to say that I feel that it should be on time every 2 years, and it should be at the beginning of the year and not at the end of the year. But I would just like to let the audience also see if other economists also feel the same way or differently, and how this will impact, again, possibly the rise of prices, and how this will also impact our competitiveness when it comes to trade and trading activities.
This is a bit tricky because I've got my personal issues and views on this. But like you, Dr. Juwita, I also feel it's timely. And it really is. I think it's a standard exercise that we have every few years or so. There is a review in the minimum wage. I feel, then this is my personal view, that, and I've sort of said this out in public before, that the biggest challenge is we are trying to answer two questions we are trying to solve two questions simultaneously. We are trying to answer how much does a household need to achieve, basic living standards, and at the same time, we are also asking the question, what would be the level that can be tolerated by businesses and firms in order that they can survive and whatnot. I thought because these two are very conflicting questions, and definitely there is a lot of power play and dynamics in that discussion space. It's sort of, to me, it's a little bit futile. So I thought a sequential approach would be better. I think first is to answer how much is needed for anyone to have a basic standard, and we can actually debate what exactly do we mean by basic living standards. But I think there are literatures out there that sort of alludes to this, and basically it's basically the same thing. And then once we find that out, I think then the next question should be asked is, yes, okay, so we know this is how much is needed. What exactly should firms do and governments do in order to ensure that everybody can achieve that standard? So how much can firms pay out of this? How much would that have an impact on its operations? And then certainly what sort of support can the government come in order to achieve that target that we're all talking about. So it's not an easy conversation to have, but obviously it's a much needed one. I think it's also an issue when it comes to wages, because what I think this is something that talks about savings going forward. Low levels of wages also would have an impact on future savings and retirement, and that would have a bigger issue. That if not addressed now, that will culminate into a much bigger problem going forward. So that's my take on it. I certainly do not have a magic number in my mind. It can be, it would take a lot of research and understanding onto what is the sort of an adequate level to it. Obviously, EPF and Bank Negara has come out before with their living wage study, and I think that's a good first step. My, I guess, 2 cents on it is it also needs to be communicated clearly to the public on what exactly it stands for. Is it something that firms should aspire to when it comes to setting up minimum wage? Maybe not. And then it has to be clarified that it differs from one place to another. I think there's a lot of, I guess, big question mark, and still needs a lot of clarification, I guess, to the public when it comes to that matter. But I think it's definitely a step in the right direction. So I'll stop here, and definitely, as usual, Isha will come in.
Yeah.
I think one issue here is that, as Shari says, one is that the cost of living differs quite widely. I think based on our research, there's a 20% difference between the Klang Valley and, for example, Kedah. So that, doesn't sound like much, but if you're talking about looking at it at, the median wage of most Malaysians, that's up to about 400 ringgit, which is significant. I think in terms of, I have to be careful what I say here because I've got NTUC and both NTUC and MEF on my board. And so this can be, okay, I can get a lot of private arguments in my ear later. But anyway, I think when we talk about implementing the minimum wage, I think like Shakira said, there's no single number that would be appropriate. Second thing is that we have to be careful that it is a dynamic situation. What might be appropriate 2 years ago may be not enough today. What might be appropriate today might not be enough 2 years from now. There needs to be, I think, a commitment towards raising it slowly across time in a much more regular fashion that can be communicated to businesses as well as employees. But I think also more importantly is the recognition that if you look at salaried workers in Malaysia, it only comprises roughly about 60% of the workforce. What about the rest? What about the gig economy? What about looking at incomes for the agriculture sector, which is quite volatile? What about contract workers and foreign workers? There are significant portions of our labor force that would not fall under the minimum wage law. I think foreign workers would come under it, but of course, implementation is another matter. And of course, the fact that sometimes it's paid in kind rather than in cash, right? So it's a very complex issue. I do think that we do need to have, I think, a more public conversation about this. We also need to look at, from the business's point of view, we need to communicate what the advantages to them would be, right? There is in economics something that's called the reservation wage. In other words, what businesses pay over the odds just to make sure that they retain workers to continue to build on productivity. So it's not just a disadvantage to companies to actually offer high wages. There are benefits that are attached to that as well, and research does support that.
Before I open up the floor for Q&A, just a quick question on, just a quick food for thought on what you have both mentioned. So again, minimum wage versus living wage. Should we then be thinking about setting different living wages or minimum wages for different localities in Malaysia as well as different sectors? Because for advanced countries like Germany, for example, they have different minimum wages for even sectors. So will that be a more feasible way? I'm sure like for monitoring purposes, it will be a headache, but will that make more sense when it comes to setting a standard for different occupations according to demand and supply of the industry itself.
I think you when referring to countries that have differentiated wages, like differentiated wages like that, they generally have a high degree of unionization. So it's a lot easier to enforce because it's largely through collective bargaining between the unions versus the employer. That is not the case in Malaysia. We do not have cross-industry unions. MTUC itself is an association, it's not a union. So while they can provide pressure, they cannot do the actual wage bargaining. So in terms of actual implementation, it's going to be very hard, especially when you look at the complexity of some of our businesses. So say, for example, plantation company, you got headquarters in KL, and you got plantations in Sabah, Sarawak. You simply can't have different wage scales depending on location, right? Or depending on occupation. Also, I think in terms of, enforcement, even with the minimum wage today, it's incredibly hard because so many businesses aren't actually registered with LHDN, or they might be with SSM, but they're not registered with LHDN. They might not register themselves with MOHR. And just to give an example, DOSM estimates we have an unemployment number of roughly about close to 700,000 people. But if you look at the number, and the increase over the pre-pandemic number was roughly about 300,000 to 400,000. But the number of people who registered as being fired or I can't remember the word now, basically let go with MOHR was only about 100K. So we have real problems, I think, in really understanding what's going on in the labor force, and and if we don't have that data, it's going to be impossible to enforce.
Yeah, just very quickly. Yeah, just very quickly on Shari. Yeah, I agree. Implementation is going to be a very big challenge, and I've said earlier that when it comes to any policies, any measures in Malaysia, the big challenge is, of course, on the implementation side. We can come up with a lot of studies on this. Having said that, I still think that it's worthwhile to at least, for the likes of EPF or any academia or BNN, for example, to continue to come up with these studies, because it benefits the workers as well. So you have an idea of how much, it takes, for example, to survive or to live, whether you're in KL or Sabah, Sarawak. That at least helps you to make an informed decision about your employment, about your job, and then what you need to do going forward. So I think nothing goes to waste for that matter. And there's definitely value in terms of differentiation when it comes to that, not just by localities, but also in terms of where you are at life stages, whether you're single, just starting out from university, or whether you are close to retirement age. Again, all this information would be useful. So I think it shouldn't stop, it should continue. But of course, there's a lot of, I guess in Malay it's called muhasabah, to really look when it comes to implementing these sort of measures going forward. So yeah, back to you, Dr. Juwita.
Thank you. Muhasabah, indeed. Self-reflection is very much needed when it comes to most of the policies implemented anywhere in the world. So I will not be selfish. I will open up the floor, the physical floor at the AIAC for the physical audience there. Are there any questions from the floor before I open it to the online questions? We already have 8 questions lined up. So before that, let's go to the floor. Sally, are there any questions from the floor at AIAC?
Hi, Dr. Juwita. Unfortunately, no at the moment. Yeah.
Okay, I will pass the floor to my co-moderator, Mr. Zinting, who will moderate the online part of the session.
Thank you both speakers for your valuable insights just now. Before that, actually, I have a personal question for myself. I hope that's okay. Just now we talked a lot about like, the macroeconomic side and the policies in place, right? So I want to ask a question from more of a microeconomic perspective. So in light of all the major and minor shocks to the market during our COVID recovery phase in Malaysia, right? How have this kind of shocks changed consumer and the firm behavior in the domestic market? And what are the policies that are needed in place to address these changes? This is a question for both of both speakers.
I'm not sure quite how to answer that. Sorry, can you just run that by me again?
Sorry?
Yeah, maybe just repeat the question.
What are the main changes in consumer and firm behavior due to the recently, and what are the policies needed?
Well, consumers, I think on the consumer side is more about survival. I think one thing that people are starting to realize is that you really need to pay attention to having emergency savings and planning ahead. It's about resilience. And I think businesses learn the same lesson, but in a slightly different way. On the one hand, you need those cash reserves. Also, I think you need to have more robustness in terms of your production processes and your supply chain. For the last 20 years or so, actually more like 30 years or so, we've been moving along this line of globalization and increasing efficiency in production. But the more efficient you become, the more fragile and the more, I think, exposed you are to shocks. And I think that's a key lesson that especially the larger companies have started to learn. And we're starting to see that reverse, I think, in terms of not just production, but also in terms of things like inventory management. Unfortunately for the consumer, what this means is that your companies are having to accept less efficiency in their production, which implies higher prices. So I think in that sense, I think a lot of the gains that we saw, especially over the last 20 years or so in terms of consumer welfare, are going to start rolling back.
No, I just add a few quick points on that. I think Hisham covered it really nicely. I think one of also the things that we saw, both on the household front and the consumer front, is of course there is an increase in digitalization, particularly for small businesses. I think that was sort of a given and something that was almost non-negotiable when sort of the pandemic hit, that you need to adapt towards that. And that sort of, in a way, the positive bit to that is it expedited the process. So we've talked about it a long time, for a while now, and that COVID was sort of like the impetus that moved everyone towards that end. Yes, I think in terms of firm survival, there's a lot of changes in flexibility and how they operate. I think on the household side, yes, we also saw a lot of households, particularly vulnerable households, dipping into the savings, and that sort of had a longer term implication that one has to think about going forward.
Yeah, I would add to that now is that we realize that telecommunications is now a necessity, it's not a luxury anymore.
Thank you both. So talking about digitalization, I think this question is best if I direct to maybe Mr. Nurhisyam. So we got this question from one of our audience. What is your take on the future of e-commerce industry? Will it lose its growth traction when the economy is fully open with physical businesses coming back in place?
No, I don't think so. I'm still buying online. I think it's been a good impetus for e-commerce. People are starting to realize it is viable, even with cottage industries. We see so many people just going on Facebook and marketing themselves that way, their businesses that way. It's here to stay. The other aspect of it is that it's on the logistical side, really. without the logistical support, e-commerce doesn't work. And I think there's been a rapid expansion on the e-commerce side, on the logistical side over the last couple of years. It's right for a little bit of consolidation, but it's also right for, I think, a little bit more certainty in terms of the service delivery. Because right now, one thing, if you've noticed with the reopening of the economy, it's getting harder and harder to get deliveries on time, oddly enough, right? And that's due to the lack of delivery partners. The gig workers that a lot of the platforms actually rely on, since they've gone back to work, right? In terms of just making sure that the quality of delivery is there, I think that's something the logistical side needs to work on, and it really needs to be solidified if you want to keep these gains from e-commerce from disappearing.
And we have the next question. I'll direct this question to Shakira, perhaps. So with all with a lot of the major economies imposing sanctions of Russia nowadays, what does it mean for Malaysia? How can Malaysia take advantage of this trend? All the sanctions in place?
Sure. I mean, on when it comes to the Ukraine military conflict, I think, as I said, there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding on this. One of the things that we sort of discuss internally is the possibility of firms or a production that are affected by the conflict shifting or moving their operations to Malaysia. Now, to the extent of this has not been sort of quantified yet, at least not internally by us, but that's that possibility moving forward. And then the industries that would benefit would, I most probably be on the E&E side, manufacturing side. That would definitely one possibility that we can see coming out of the current sanctions imposed by on Russia at the moment.
Thank you, Shakira, for that. We have this next question. It's directed to Mr. Nurhisyam. So what do you think of the call for EPF withdrawals that the government has done in the past year? And what are the reasons and how do we address them what are the main reasons behind this withdrawals and how did it actually affect the economy itself and also the EPF members' future resilience?
Okay, let me show you the numbers actually, because I actually have the slides here with me. Very quickly. So let me run through this. I think that's just an overview. This is when the EPF withdrawals were allowed for, and this is mapped against Google Mobility Trends for Workplaces. So you can see that at every point in time, it was largely due to lockdowns. So you had IDEAS during the first MCO. IC now was, we had state-based lockdowns, regional-based lockdowns, area-based lockdowns. And you can see that continuous deterioration in people going to work. And ICHITRA, of course, was the second national MCO and basically covered that whole area. So the EPF withdrawals were basically about survival. People were not able to go to work. They were stuck at home. They had issues in terms of, I think, generating income, especially for a lot of our non-salary members. We also had those who still continue to have a job. Most of them lost their overtime and other benefits. So again, it was a cash crunch, I think, for a lot of our Malaysian households. But as you can see on the right there, I mean, we were almost back to pre-pandemic, at least in terms of people coming back to work. There has been a structural shift from people working from home. So it's not going to come all the way back. But having said that, we're pretty close to where we were before. So the necessity for further withdrawal is much less because people can go out, people can go back to work, even though they might carry over some of the issues from the past couple of years, like debt overhang or what have you. The fact of the matter is they're not locked up at home anymore. Now, in terms of the impact on the economy, I'll skip over this one. This is the impact on savings. This is based on a basic savings requirement of 240,000. So we roughly lost about 10 years in terms of retirement adequacy due to these withdrawals. And you can see the numbers in terms of where our membership is. We had a 30% increase in terms of people with less than 10,000 ringgit. We have 2.6 million members now with effectively zero savings. And, that's something that we were going to have to address going forward. I think from our point of view, the economy is reopening where we're not going to go into lockdown again. I mean, from April 1st, even the borders are going to be reopened, people going back to work. We're moving forward rather than looking back. We're thinking about recovering rather than thinking about survival. We're thinking about rebuilding savings rather than looking at further withdrawals.
Give me 1 minute, sorry. The next question, I think I'll open this question to both speakers. So what are the main impacts of the pandemic on the gig economy in Malaysia? And how has it generally changed the economic, the employment structure in Malaysia?
Okay. I think, when we talk about the gig economy, we're talking about a whole range of different phenomena. Most people just talk about the platforms, right? And the number of people on the platforms isn't actually very big. We're talking about, I don't know, there's lots of different estimates out there, but it's between 600 to 800,000, right? But it seems to be going up and down, I think, in terms of how the formal economy is doing. So, like I said previously, I think both Grab, Foodpanda, all of them are having a bit more difficulty, I think, getting people to come on to really work full time with them. It's now that the formal economy is reopened. So, like I said, I think this needs to be regularized. I'm not sure I'm completely supportive of the proposed amendment in the Employment Act to basically formalize gig workers as employees, because it really is a very different category of worker. And I think you have to be sensitive, more empathetic about their situation rather than trying to shoehorn them into a particular category, especially in terms of benefits and the like. Because it is a very different type of category. I think the gig economy is here to stay. It's not going to be a majority, but I do think that we need to understand the circumstances there a bit better to create a framework that works for them.
Yeah, so just very quickly on that, I think one thing we have to take note, I guess, especially during the pandemic, definitely sort of gig economy, all these platforms really was provided some support, income support to a lot of households. And we saw that in one of our own internal phone surveys that we did across households in the country. So we saw a lot of people who experienced employment disruptions resorted to sort of jobs in some of these platforms. So it really was, I guess, for a lot of households, provided a lot of relief on that end. I on the same page as Hisham when it comes to sort of categorizing them as formal workers, because it definitely is a different nature altogether. But to add to that, I also think that in one of the things that we've highlighted is in whatever form of a categorization that we put out, it is important to ensure that these group of workers are protected when they take on that employment, because a lot of them are not. At the moment, I don't know the developments around this. I sort of like a bit behind on this, but at the moment it was sort of like opt-in kind of option, for them to sort of give contribution, but perhaps an auto sort of contribution would be helpful on that end. And that would definitely be, to me, a step in the right direction. But yeah, in terms of, classifying them as formal workers themselves, and maybe a slightly sort of hesitant on that. Yeah.
Workplace. So like over the pandemic period, there are a lot of changes in the workplace. Like there's a trend of job switching, and then there's also a trend of a rise of home-based economy, especially in Malaysia during the pandemic when we cannot go to office to work. So in your opinion, is this like, will this be a trend for future, or will this be a transitional phenomena for the economy? And how should policymakers actually address this when they're formulating any policies in future?
Sorry, we didn't get the first part of that. We lost you a bit for the first part.
My line is a bit weak. So let me rephrase my question. So will the trend of job switching and also I would say it's a decentralization of work. Like a lot of people actually have 2 full-time jobs at the same time, and a lot of like rise of home-based economy. Will this kind of trend be set in future, or do you think it would just be a transitionary phenomena in Malaysia?
No, I don't think it's transitory. I think fundamentally we go back to that issue that we've been referring to before, which is the rising cost of living. And I think the reality is that for most people, having a side hustle is a necessity. It's no longer a luxury. It's no longer about coffee money. It's about survival. And I think the same kind of pressures are driving more women into the workforce as well. You need to have that 2-income family to actually survive and bring up kids, because it's just not doable for a single person to actually carry that load anymore. Even for those who are relatively higher educated and have decent jobs, the cost of bringing up children is so expensive that they don't have an alternative. They have to do it. So I think this is going to be a continuing feature. Especially, and I think this goes back to the fact that we don't really have a good social safety net. If there's no safety net, then you have to provide it for yourself, and that is really about getting enough income to be able to save enough to tide over any difficulties that you might have. So I think this is going to be a continuing feature. I think it's going to be something that is going to be more prevalent, and is also something I think we need to take a serious look at. And fundamentally, we look at what other governments are doing around the world, what other countries are doing around the world, is trying to strengthen that social safety net because they recognize this problem.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add to what Shabda said, but I agree that this is definitely something that's here to stay, particularly with rising cost of living pressures. And really, the reality is it's almost a luxury to just survive on a single income household these days. I mean, you're very lucky and very fortunate to be in that situation if you are in. I think, yes, it basically goes back to our sort of initial discussion point earlier about social safety net and really the need to look deeper into it. In this regard, definitely, the view is fiscal policy has to play a bigger role. But for it to play a bigger role, then the question is it has to collect more and spend better. And there, I think that's a lot of conversation that needs to take place, not just in terms of policy. I also feel that when it comes to revenue, there's this thing about taxation, and that I think the perception to the public is important as well, managing their expectations. That's where governance and importance of public sector delivery is also important. On that note, I think in terms of childcare, for example, it's definitely very costly, and in some places in more advanced economies, these things are subsidized by the government. It's part of the overall social safety net. It's not currently. So I would say that that's I guess if we are going to leave the conversation today, that's something that's worth taking home and giving a bigger thought about it.
We lost you again.
Direct this question to Puan Shakira. Can you comment on the impact of trade agreements on the Malaysian economy, especially during this recovery period? Are they significant in pushing our economy or trade?
Just be very quick on that. In general, trade agreements, especially done right, yes, it will benefit the economy. But I think what is more important, it has to be supplemented with measures to improve the country's competitiveness. So relying just on signing to trade agreement is just one thing. You need to sort of improve your competitiveness relative to other countries as well in order to really benefit from those trade agreements. Yes.
Mr. Nurhisyam, do you have anything to add on to that? We do. Feel free.
Okay, just taking a step back, you look at where we are in terms of globalization. We shifted from really largely multilateral approach under the WTO and gradually broke it down to regional because nobody could come to an agreement in terms of the way forward. Also, I think over the last 10 years, especially since the global financial crisis, there has been a slow but significant retreat away from globalization. So the kind of trade deals that Malaysia is involved in today, it's useful as to bolster our connections to the world in that environment. Will they be significant in the sense of really boosting growth and things like that? Not really. It will help, I think, in terms of consumer welfare, especially to have a larger variety of goods and more markets that we can go to. So it does bring incremental benefits. It's not a game changer.
Thank you. The next question I'll keep it open for both panelists as well. So feel free to take that question if you want to. So according to Dawson, half of B40 and M40 are renting in Klang Valley area, but policies on the other hand remain focused on facilitating ownership but not renting affordability. So if wages remain stagnant as well as house prices, what policies can be introduced to address the cost of living among renters, especially in Klang Valley?
Tough question. To be honest, I think the whole issue of housing needs a rethink at the national level. The big problem that we have in terms of housing is that property is effectively a state matter under the Constitution. And which is why when you look at what the federal government tries to do, it's almost always on the financing side. They don't talk about the supply side because they have no control over it effectively. That's why even if you look at, for example, Prima, the prices are not exactly affordable either, right? And so that whole issue of the supply side is really where you need to attack that problem of home ownership as well as rental. Having said that, I think in terms of facilitating a rental market, we do need a rental act that covers both the rights as well as the obligations of both the landlord as well as the renter. What we have today does not really provide the insurance to landlords to provide housing on the rental market. But also we don't have enough protection from people who, for example, might not be able to pay. It's still between the individual landlord and the renter, and really do need some legal protections for both sides to enable the market to grow.
Yes, just from my end, in terms of housing market itself, I think done a report on this quite a while ago in terms of cost of living, and definitely in terms of housing is one of the, I guess, main drivers of why people perceive high cost of, or actually experience high cost of living in the country. And it, like Nurhisyam said, a lot of it falls on the state side, state government side, because most of it is nothing comes out from the federal government. And then we actually looked at a couple of schemes in Selangor as well as KL, and most of the time, many of the schemes sort of provide the reverse incentives, or it sort of backfires in terms of the initial objective. So the intention is very noble to provide, affordable housing to certain groups, but somehow the mechanics of it sort of incentivize the developers to move towards the other side of the market, move towards the high end market. I feel that there are certain sort of measures that you can put in place just to keep this sort of behavior in check. One thing that we don't have here in Malaysia is vacancy tax. So this sort of would, to some extent, mitigate that issue of oversupply. And really, the issue here is not, there is a high. It's really about mismatch in supply and demand. There is a big supply of the high-end housing market that doesn't cater to the demand of what the population needs. So quick measures such as vacancy tax, it's not going to solve the problem, but definitely it sort of will mitigate, or at least provide some form of cushion going forward.
Sorry, Zinting, we cannot hear you. Can you repeat that, please? Sorry, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes, loud and clear.
Let's. I guess we'll take one more question before we proceed to wrapping up the session. Okay. So I believe that just now we mentioned a lot about social safety net, and it is really and the pandemic has revealed the significance of this one. But then at the same time, Malaysia is actually having a tight fiscal space as well, especially after all the social transfers that we have done in the past. So what would actually be the realistic ways to strengthen Malaysia's social safety net? So basically, how should we actually start it? And what can we do to sustain it in the future? Thank you.
Okay. All right. Instead of talking about Malaysia, I'll tell you what Chile is doing. Chile just voted in a new government. What they're doing, because they also allow for pension withdrawals over the last couple of years, 3 of them at last count. So what the new government is proposing is a threefold reform. First, they're creating a national health insurance scheme funded by contributions from both employers and employees. Second is that they're creating a national pension scheme. Because right now they're very similar to EPF. It's all the defined contribution. So they're creating a defined benefit plan to actually cover most of the population. And at the same time, they're doing tax reform. So all these 3 things are tied together. You need to look at tax reform to raise the resources to fund the social safety net. You also have to look at reforming the safety net to ensure that it covers everybody. And we've had some of those conversations here in Malaysia. There has been that proposal to create a national health insurance scheme. We have been discussing the possibility of extending the EPF system and also creating a system that caters to those people who fall out of the EPF ambit. And we talked about tax reform, but really it's a package. You have to do all 3 together. But that does require a national consensus. We have to not only understand that this is required, we also have to trust the government to be able to carry it out. And I think that's where the governance aspects of things comes in.
So I think just on my end, we have a base, and that's tight fiscal space. So let's take a step back and not focus on increasing the debt, although that's basically a big crux of the issue here. So I thought there are 3 things that we can do at least in the short term. better targeting, better delivery, and better monitoring. So in terms of targeting, we've talked about this earlier. First, maybe just to address the fragmentation bit, there's to have a consolidated database of individuals, and then we can improve the targeting from there. And related to that is, of course, better data environment, better data sharing, and more improved. Yeah, everyone will nod their heads when it comes to data, so that's very important. I thought in terms of delivery, that can be improved as well. I think there are tons of literature out there when it comes to provision of social safety net, that cash is always best. And for some reason, sometimes I don't understand why that idea may sometimes doesn't translate to our own actions here in Malaysia. So there is always a preference for vouchers. At one point, I think there was talks about having a card for the petroleum scheme, and then focusing it on just people who have vehicles of this certain category and whatnot. So why complicate the system? Because when you do that, it increases the cost of it. And when you have tight fiscal buffers or tight fiscal space, so you don't have that much financial resources, we can improve or strive towards efficiency at least. And on that front, I think the current spending that we are doing on social sectors, for example, health and education, that can be improved as well. That can be part of a social spending. So for example, as we move towards an aging population, for example, maybe within health spending, there should be a bigger allocation on NCD, for example, non-communicable diseases, because that will happen as we age going forward. And then finally, improve in terms of the monitoring of some of the existing programs. Again, there is no sort of formalized approach in terms of monitoring the who is receiving what, how it's spent, and whatnot. Again, these sort of three things, it doesn't involve a lot of money, but I think at least in the near term, that's something that for the policymakers to think about. Yeah.
Yeah, let me add to that, because I think the data challenges are underappreciated in Malaysia. Okay, so let me give you some numbers. We have 50 million members on the EPF. Only 7.8 million actually are active in terms of contributions. So we can only track about 7.8 million people in terms of what their incomes are, supposedly. LHDN has roughly about 7 million files, a little bit less than us, out of 23 million adults. SOCSO has very similar numbers to us, and as a matter of fact, there's a lot of overlap between us. So if you look at the numbers of people where the government actually has data on, compared to the population it should have data on, we've only got a little under 50%. We have no idea what the other 50% are doing, essentially, or what the circumstances are, or how they're doing. And it gets further complicated when we base our targeting on very unhelpful categories like B40 and 40 T20, right? So let me just give you an example. If somebody earns 3,000 ringgit, they're staying on their own, they're a B40 household. If you get a roommate who's earning 3,000 ringgit, you're an M40 household. If you live in a house with 4 roommates, each of them earning 3,000 ringgit, you're a T20 household. Does that make sense from an individual perspective? It doesn't, right? So those kinds of challenges, I think, in terms of categorization, in terms of understanding what's going on with Malaysians, are some of the hurdles that the government has to overcome in terms of targeted delivery. It's a lot harder than it sounds.
So, okay, I'll pass the floor back to Dr. Juwita to do some wrapping up. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zenting. As we are nearing our 4 p.m. mark, may I invite Puan Shakira to share what she hopes for the Malaysian economy this year post-pandemic, given the micro and macroeconomic challenges and also opportunities that we have talked about in the last hour or so.
Well, it's a laundry list, isn't it? I mean, if you want to ask what my hopes are. But very quickly, I think maybe I sort of segment into short term and long term. I think in terms of short term, I do hope that in terms of socials, again, we talked about it just a while ago, there should be continued support or targeted support towards vulnerable households, at least in not lifting the brake too quickly on this, and because I think that will be detrimental in light of the uncertainty that we are facing at this current juncture. I think that's very much on in the short term. I suppose on the medium term towards the longer end, and I'm going to go back to a fiscal policy and really, I sound like a broken record by this time, I think, but really we need to look at how we can rebuild fiscal buffers, because I think one of the biggest lessons that we learned during the pandemic is countries which entered the crisis with a larger fiscal space was able to provide better support for its citizens, for its population. And that really underscores the importance of why we need to, really seriously look into this matter. We didn't get to discuss this much, but I also suppose in the same breath, hopefully there would be more serious discussion about policy implementation, again, over the medium term and long term. We do, like I said before, we do very nice analysis, very nice studies, us here at the bank, EPF, anywhere you go. I guess the next level or the next step is definitely ensuring that some of this takes place and it's done well, not just for the sake of doing it. So maybe I'll leave it there and back to you.
What about you, Mr. Nurhisyam? Looking at all of the micro and macroeconomic challenges and opportunities, what are your hopes in the medium and long term for the Malaysian economy?
I saw a comment on Twitter the other day. It said, we didn't expect to live through the entire 20th century in 2 years. And that's what we went through, basically, from pandemic to war to all kinds of things going on, right? So my wish is that a return to normality, a return to a little bit of sanity, I think. And I think with reopening of borders, I think the fact that most of us have been vaccinated, we're starting to accept COVID as a pandemic, we can start moving on towards other things in life, so to speak. And the focus here is not so much on emergency measures anymore. It's like Shakira says, we need to move forward. We need to look at all the policies that we need to do in terms of creating a better Malaysia. It's a whole laundry list. I think if you read the RMK 12, it seems like they put everything but the kitchen sink in there. And really, as she said, it's all about the implementation. It's about evidence-based policy. It's about cost-benefit analysis. It's about really improving the efficiency and effectiveness, I think, of policy making. That I think a lot of Malaysians would like to see. But I also think that it does require acceptance on the part of also Malaysians that if this is the thing that we want, then sacrifices are required, buy-in is required, and we have to do it together rather than somebody just trying to ram it down our throats, kind of a thing. You can't depend on experts anymore. We're all in this together, I think. So in that sense, I think that wider conversation around where Malaysia is heading, what we need to do to get there, needs to happen. And that's what I'd like to see.
Thank you so much to the speakers, Puan Shakira and Mr. Nurhisyam, for your very informative and enlightening views. And I would like to also thank the audiences for their awesome questions. And we hope that with the COVID pandemic or the COVID variant weakening, we can rise into a new normal or a new sanity as we enter the endemic phase. And we hope that inflation rates will be tamed and that investments and trade activities will continue to increase, backed by positive consumer and business sentiments on the ground. Thank you so much. Back to you, Sally.
Thanks, Dr. Juwita. Thank you to all our esteemed speakers, Mr. Nurhisyam Hussein and Ms. Shakira Teh. And thank you to our moderator, Dr. Juwita, and also co-moderator, Mr. Zenting, for such a wonderful session. We have come to the end of the conference today. We would like to extend our warmest gratitude to all our esteemed speakers and our online participants for attending. We hope that the conference today has provided us with insights on the future of the policy-making world and how we can all contribute to create a better future. With that, Thank you all and have a great day ahead.